You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining this special edition of the American Revolution. Our guest on our roundtable this month was Carl Borick, who is director of the Charleston Museum in Charleston, South Carolina. Borick is also the author of 3 books about South Carolina's role in the Revolution. These books are A Gallant Defense, The Siege of Charleston in 1780, Relieve Us of This Burden, American Prisoners of War in the Revolutionary South, 1780 to 1782, and his upcoming book, Backcountry Resistance, South Carolina's Militia and the Fight for American Independence. Mr. Borick joined our roundtable earlier this month to discuss South Carolina's role in the American Revolution. Welcome, everybody, to the American Revolution Roundtable for the American Revolution Podcast. We're joined tonight by Carl Borick, who is the director of the Charleston Museum in Charleston, South Carolina. He's also the author of several books, one on the Siege of Charleston, another on prisoners of the American Revolution, and a new book that's coming out soon on the resistance, I guess, after Charleston. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Carl, welcome to the American Revolution Podcast. We're happy to have you here, and our topic for tonight is generally South Carolina's role in the American Revolution. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Mike.
One question that I think it's good to get out at the start is, what do you think the political alignment was of South Carolina at the beginning of the war? Was there an East-West divide among the people, or was it very divided between Tories and Patriots, or what do you think?
Well, interestingly, in the late 1760s, there was a lot of unrest in the backcountry of South Carolina and the interior because, it had developed pretty rapidly after the Cherokee War, which was in the 1750s. And so you didn't have a lot of attention. There were lack of courts, there were lack of schools, there were lack of churches. And a lot of the people in the interior felt like they were being ignored by the South Carolina Colonial Assembly. And so there was quite a bit of unrest. And it's amazing when you get to 1780, which is only about 13 years after this was happening, because I think there was more unrest towards the South Carolina Assembly than there was towards the Crown in the late 1760s. And so one thing that just fascinated me in the research for my latest book is how much unanimous support for the revolution there was, because there was so much resistance against the British as invaders. So, to kind of answer your question, I think there was a lot of concern among the low country elites, and they're the ones, the rice planters and the merchants and the lawyers in Charleston. I think there was a lot of concern about how much support there was going to be. And I think really one thing, or actually two things, are going to kind of solidify that. One is the defeat of the British at the Battle of Sullivan's Island, which I know we're going to talk about just a little bit. Yeah. But the other thing, which I think is probably equally important, is there was a Cherokee uprising all along the frontiers of Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia in July of 1776. The South Carolina Provincial Congress was very quick to raise men and to send military supplies into the backcountry. And I think that probably went a long way towards, solidifying the support for the revolution in the backcountry.
I know there was a regulator movement in both North and South Carolina, although they were different movements, but they were more the frontiersmen being upset at the Eastern elites and what the Eastern elites were doing to them. It's interesting that the North Carolina regulators tended to lean Tory during the war, probably mostly because the Easterners were patriots and they were opposed to whatever the Easterners were for.
Right.
But you think in South Carolina, it kind of gelled and unified into a patriot movement all from the beginning.
Yeah, and in fact, it was exactly the opposite. A lot of the regulator leaders actually became Whigs during the fight against the British.
At the outbreak of the war, there wasn't a whole lot going on in Charleston. Charleston, of course, was one of the 4 cities that impounded tea in 1773. But when war broke out in New England, it was pretty much isolated to a New England war. Is the assault on Sullivan's Island in 1776 the first really major effect of the war coming to South Carolina?
In terms that involved British regulars, yes. In November of 1775, there was an uprising by some loyalists in the backcountry. And again, the Provincial Congress acted pretty quickly to raise men to suppress that. They actually reached a truce at 96, which would be a major siege later in 1781 under Greene. And then up in the Greenville area of South Carolina, the western part of South Carolina, they had what was known as the Snow Campaign. It was in December of 1775. And they really were effective in suppressing the Loyalists. So as far as the Battle of Sullivan's Island, though, yeah, that was the first time British regular Army and Royal Navy forces were here.
Yeah, I think the royal governors were attempting to raise a loyalist army, and the patriots were doing their best to suppress that from the beginning.
That's correct. Yeah.
So yeah, Sullivan's Island was the first time the British regulars came in force, I guess. General Henry Clinton was up at the siege of Boston, where General Howe was still in command, and he sent Clinton down here, where I guess Clinton met a naval force that was coming over from Ireland, and which included Lord Cornwallis, and their job was to very quickly take Charleston so that they could then move up back for the invasion of New York that was planned for later in 1776, correct?
So the original intention was to support the Loyalists in North Carolina. They received word that there was a good number of Loyalists who were being raised in North Carolina, but they were defeated pretty soundly at the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge in February.
Right.
And so when the Royal Navy arrives off the coast of North Carolina in May, they're like, well, what do we do now? Lord William Campbell, who was the last royal governor of South Carolina, was with them. And he convinces Peter Parker and Henry Clinton that Charleston is pretty lightly defended. They target Sullivan's Island, which is a sea island just north of the city, as a place where they could maybe create a rallying point for Loyalists.
Right. And yeah, I guess their job, their hope was to accumulate a loyalist army to take the city and then leave a loyalist army in charge of the colony as best they could. We've got the British Navy, commanded by Peter Parker, bringing in an army commanded by General Clinton, and they are hoping to take Charleston. And of course, the Patriot forces here have been joined by General Charles Lee, who is at this point third in command of the Continental Army and generally considered by both sides to be America's top military expert and strategist. Charles Lee tells the local South Carolinians to get out of Fort Sullivan on Sullivan's Island. That
That's correct.
Hold this thing. You're crazy if you try. You're just all going to get captured. Why did they think they could hold it, and why were they able to hold it?
It's funny because I think William Moultrie, who was the ranking South Carolina officer, said that Lee literally called it a slaughter pen. The South Carolinians have always been proud of their military prowess. Other than their belief that they could hold it, is the only answer I have on that.
Yeah, I think it was a matter of we've got to show how brave we are.
Sure.
But the fort didn't even have a back wall, and if the British had
correct
around, it probably would have been a slaughter. And I think it was kind of lucky that they were never able to do that. And of course, famously, the palmetto walls in the front were green and just seemed to suck up cannonballs without much damage being taken to them. And so they were able to hold on pretty well. And also the tide worked. I guess the British were going to land troops and march on the fort, and they weren't able to do that because of the tides and some other stuff.
So, yeah, the Americans actually had a redoubt on the north side of Sullivan's Island. The British were on Isle of Palms, which is just north of Sullivan's Island. Mm-hmm. And they had misjudged the depth of breach inlet, which separates the two. They also met pretty stiff resistance from Colonel William Danger Thompson, who was stationed on the north side of Sullivan's Island. It's supposed to be a joint land-sea attack, right? Clinton's not able to get across, so the Royal Navy's on its own. And the other thing that happens is the north side, or kind of the right flank of the fort, was exposed. It was on a tidal creek or what's the intercoastal waterway now. Parker's plan was to send 3 frigates around to that side of the fort and bombard it from there. And that would have been a disaster for the Americans because they really would not have had good cover. So fortunately, and this is the other thing that works in the Americans' favor that day, is there's a shoal on which Fort Sumter now stands that those 3 frigates all ran aground on at the outset of the battle, and they could not get the ships off. And so that left Parker with 3 other vessels, the Bristol with 3 other vessels, to face Sullivan's Island on their own. You got basically 2 major parts of a 3-part plan are off the table for the British. They probably should have called it off, but didn't. And so you've got a fixed fortification with these palmetto log walls and sand that are going to, swallow up these cannonballs, as you mentioned. and the British are out there anchored, moored with wooden sailing vessels. Other than the fact that the Americans are short on ammunition, it's kind of the situation sort of favors them.
Of course, yeah, it was a terrible loss, and the British had to withdraw, accomplishing nothing. General Clinton whined about this for years afterwards.
Mm-hmm. Yes, he did.
And he was trying to blame Admiral Parker or Commodore Parker for all these things. And yeah,
He later, after the Siege of Charleston, he goes out in a boat and has some soundings done off Sullivan's Island to prove, because I think Parker said that he got within 400 yards or something like that, and Clinton literally went out in a boat to disprove that. So yeah, as you well know, Mike, he was a guy who didn't forget easily.
No, he did not. So yeah, when the British were under a limited time pressure with this anyway, because they did have to get up to New York for the invasion there. After they left Charleston, things were pretty quiet for the next couple of years, right?
That's right.
Yeah, there was not a whole lot going on in the Carolinas. I think the only thing really going on in the South was some Tories from Florida that were coming up into Georgia and a few things like that. The next time that the South really gets involved in the war, I guess, is December 1778,
That's
when
right.
the British come and invade Savannah, Georgia. And that's under Colonel Archibald Campbell. And once they have secured Georgia and they claim they have taken a star off the Union flag and that Georgia is now a successful British colony once again, they set their eyes on South Carolina. There was a raid on Charleston in the spring of 1779, correct?
Correct.
Why don't you tell us a little about that?
Sure. So Campbell's replaced by Augustine Prevost in 1779. Benjamin Lincoln is now the American Southern Department commander. And, Lincoln's pretty highly thought of. He, fought pretty bravely at Saratoga. He's badly wounded there. He's highly thought of by Washington, also by the Continental Congress. So he's, fairly competent. He wants to try and drive the British out of Georgia. So with the British kind of ensconced, kind of in the northwestern part of Georgia, he moves his army towards Augusta. Prevost takes advantage of that by making a direct march for Charleston. And arrives here in late April of 79. He doesn't have the equipment. He doesn't have the artillery. He really doesn't have what it would take to actually besiege the city.
Well,
But
yeah, my understanding is it wasn't even really his intention to take the city. He was on a foraging expedition, and it just so happened he met so little resistance that he ended up.
They just kept right on going. Yeah, they plundered the heck out of the area between Savannah and Charleston, which there were a lot of rice plantations down there. The town, leaders, though, were about ready to give up. In fact, they had made an offer that if Charleston was left untouched, that they would, basically surrender South Carolina. That's one thing to say that, but like I said, with the resistance that the British would face in the backcountry, actually putting that in practice was doubtful. Fortunately, General Moultrie was able to kind of take charge of things, and he said, "No, we're going to fight it out." They send a response to Prevost, and he ends up retreating back down to Savannah.
Yeah, he never had the forces to take the city. He was kind of blustering to get
Correct.
it.
Yeah, that's right.
1,000 troops that were, at least on the front line there with him. Yeah, that politicians basically wanted to offer up neutrality and say,
correct.
Well, you can occupy Charleston and we'll take no position. But the army, the state army under Moultrie, basically said, no, we're going to fight you.
That's right.
That immediate threat goes away. But the following year, of course, we have a much larger invasion. General Clinton, who was deeply embarrassed by not being able to take Charleston the first time, decides to make a second run at it. And of course, by this time, the British have captured and abandoned Philadelphia. They're kind of in a part of the war where they're pulling back in a lot of ways and trying to consolidate because they're getting ready to fight France and of course, later Spain. Why was it important to take Charleston in 1780?
So you hit it right on the head, Mike, with the mention of France, right? So, the French recognizing American independence and now providing direct, as you know, they provided a lot of indirect aid before 1778, providing direct military assistance to the Americans changes the nature of the war for the British, right? They're no longer able to submit or to devote the scale of resources, both in men and material, to the war in North America. But that being said, we go back to our loyalists. A lot of these, or a number of these former royal officials in the southern colonies basically said, hey, listen, there's large numbers of loyalists down here. You just need to bring your military forces down here, defeat these rebels in battle, with our assistance, and we'll be able to take power again. And so that's what the capture of Savannah is based on, that, and operations in Georgia. So the idea is, capture Charleston, which is, as you mentioned earlier, is one of the four primary cities in the 13 colonies, arguably one of the wealthiest, along with New York. So, cut off that trade, which is what Clinton pointed out was one of the objectives, but then also establish a base to then move into the interior and, link up with these loyalists and retake another one of these colonies.
I always joke as the British are acting kind of like Charlie Brown with the football. They were initially told when they went into New England, that's just a few bad apples. You go in there, everybody. They found that was not the case.
Yeah,
they went
you'll find some somewhere, right? I mean, that's what it came down to.
And then they went into the Mid-Atlantic region. They were told, it'll be much better there. There's much larger loyalist force there. And they found out the loyalists that were there were all Quakers. They wouldn't fight. They were still fighting everybody who would fight. And then their third effort was, at least the southern colonies are chock full of loyalists, and we can certainly secure that so easily. And that didn't go so well either. They did take Charleston, and it was, I guess, it was a siege. It took them several months to actually capture the city. One of the things I found fascinating, and I guess does not improve my opinion of the South Carolinian leadership, was that they essentially prevented Lincoln and the Continental Army from withdrawing from the city when they had the chance. And then once the British had them completely surrounded, they essentially insisted that the Continental Army surrender so that the city wouldn't be destroyed.
Yeah, interesting. One of the reasons I wanted to bring up that 79 campaign, Mike, that really burns Lincoln, because he's roundly criticized by the civilian leadership in Charleston for essentially abandoning Charleston in 1779 and allowing the British to march on the city. And so I think that really instills in him a desire to protect the city, right? But in the midst of the siege, both Lackland McIntosh, the Continental General from Georgia, and William Moultrie, the Continental General from South Carolina, they said, we should at least try to get the Continentals out, right, while the British are besieging them on the peninsula and the Royal Navy's already in the harbor. And they're literally in the process of discussing that when the first British bombardment takes place. They reconvene a week later, and they're in the midst of discussing that again. And that's when Christopher Gadsden, who's lieutenant governor of South Carolina, Governor Rutledge, had been sent into the backcountry to try and raise militia. So he's the ranking civilian official. He comes in. He's aghast that they're talking about evacuation. He asked that they recess, and he wants to bring his Privy Council members in and join the discussion. So they reconvene later. And one of the men, Thomas Ferguson, is pretty... He's a little more direct. They're all beating up Lincoln and these officers, but he basically says that if the Continental troops try to escape, he would be among the first to open the gates to the British and assist them in attacking the Continentals as they're trying to get into their boats. So Lincoln is really caught between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, no, it's an impossible position. And of course, it ends up being the largest surrender of Continental forces and Patriot forces during the entire war.
Correct.
And a lot of people kind of thought that Georgia had already been taken, and it appeared that South Carolina had been taken at this point, and that the war was somewhat lost in the South. There was, however, a great bit of resistance around South Carolina. The British had captured the big city, much like they did in Boston, and much like they did in New York, and much like they did in Philadelphia, and could not conquer the surrounding region. The people continued to resist and fight, and I use the analogy of, it's not like fighting a bear that you can go, he can stop you and you can have a fight, he can beat you. It's like fighting a swarm of bees. You can go wherever you want, but it's going to hurt and you're going to get stung everywhere along the way. And that seemed to happen in South Carolina as well.
Yeah, I make the point. I'm very fortunate. We have a group of officers from Fort Bragg, U.S. Special Forces, come down about 3 times a year. They're in a captain's course. Most of them are lieutenants who are about to make captain or just made captain. We talk about the Siege of Charleston, but then, also talk about the war in the backcountry. And so here's the thing about the fall of Charleston. All the Continental troops in the state are basically captured there. There's one other battle at Waxhaws. There's another detachment of Continentals that's pretty much annihilated by Tarleton. And so, you have this British conventional force, right? They're the only conventional forces in the state now because the Continentals are gone. And they go out and they're facing a very unconventional army, right? That fights kind of on their own terms, hit and run, ambush, disappear into the swamps, after actions. The point I always make to these guys is whether you're talking about 1960s Vietnam or 21st century Afghanistan and Iraq or 1780 South Carolina, it's very difficult for conventional forces to deal with forces that fight unconventionally.
The British were fighting under conflicting strategies too. You had Cornwallis, who was trying to make friends with all the South Carolinians and show them that living under the king would be to their advantage. And then you had Banastre Tarleton, who was of the view of, we're going to treat everyone who does not voluntarily and wholeheartedly join us as an enemy, and we will treat them with, we will kill them, we will burn their property, we will, completely destroy them. So yeah, you had these two conflicting strategies at work, and neither of them seemed to be able to succeed.
Right.
And then, of course, Francis Marion really comes into his own as the Swamp Fox during this period, as being one of the leaders of the leadership, and Thomas Sumter is also very active. So yeah, it's a difficult situation. The Americans can't hold any territory, but they can make life miserable for the British when they try to hold anything outside of Charleston.
Right. They can't technically hold territory, but what they can do is keep the British out of areas. And that's the really amazing thing about Francis Marion. So Marion's a Continental Army officer. He's a lieutenant colonel of the 2nd South Carolina. He was actually at the siege. The story goes that there was a party at the beginning of the siege by an American officer. He invites a number of officers, including Marion. He locks the doors of his parlor, insists on his guests drink a number of toasts to, the Continental Congress and to General Washington, et cetera. Well, according to a 19th century biographer, I don't know if it was Weems or, might have been William Gilmore Simms, basically says, oh, no, Marion was a teetotaler, so he's taken aback by this heavy drinking and lets himself out a first floor window and either breaks or severely sprains his ankle. Well, we have a really, really nice liquor box in the Charleston Museum that belonged to Francis Marion, so I'm a little skeptical of that part of the story. But I will say this. On April 13th, Lincoln evacuated all his wounded officers out of Charleston, and Marion was one of them. So something happened to him early in the siege, and so he's evacuated. He goes back to his plantation to recuperate, and so he's not captured in the city. But this is what I just find fascinating about him. So he's back in the field right after the Battle of Camden, mid-August of 1780. And he tells Gates in October that he never operated with more than 60 or 70 men, right? And so he's operating between what's known as the PD River and the Santee River in South Carolina, kind of eastern South Carolina. Cornwallis, Wright, and James Weems correspond back and forth. And Weems basically says this area between the Santee and PD are in an entire state of rebellion. And that is primarily Marion, with these quick strike tactics, attacking loyalist plantations, attacking loyalists that are gathering together to join the British. It is amazing what he accomplishes with really a small number of men and making the British think, basically an exponential effect on what he's doing tactically.
Yeah. And yeah, as you say, after we lost an entire Continental Army at Charleston, the Americans sent down a second large Continental Army under Horatio Gates, which was essentially completely wiped out at Camden.
Correct.
The militia, which was mostly from Virginia, ran away and went home, and the Continentals were just slaughtered. So one might think at this point that the Americans might just have to write off South Carolina and Georgia because they've already lost two armies and they still need some armies up north to do the fighting there. That's when Nathaniel Greene gets his appointment as the Southern commander.
Correct.
It takes Greene, I guess, a while, probably early 1781 before he really gets down there, maybe late 1780. But during that entire, 6 or 8 month period, Francis Marion is pretty much on his own, as you say, with a few dozen men at most of the time. It's a pretty bleak period for the Patriot cause in South Carolina.
Yes and no. So, because the other guy who's pretty active, and honestly, these two are not the only ones. The other one who's really active is Thomas Sumter. And Thomas Sumter is really effective at raising men. And in fact, around the time of the Battle of Hanging Rock and then, later Fishing Creek, which is a major defeat for him, he's got probably 900 to 1,000 men. Now, some of those men have marched down from North Carolina, the North Carolina militia. But he's really effective at raising men. Cornwallis refers to him as our great plague in this country because he's, very effective at raising men. And, really the British, they can't really make inroads into the northern part of South Carolina. And Cornwallis has it in his head that they are going to invade North Carolina and this will make everything better. My new book, one of the things I criticize him for is like, okay, you haven't fully pacified Georgia. There's still resistance there. You haven't fully pacified South Carolina. There's a lot of resistance there. So now you're going to advance into North Carolina and kind of leave things unsettled behind you. And that's what he plans on doing. He marches up to Charlotte in September, and he sends out on his flank the inspector of militia for the British Army in South Carolina. That's Patrick Ferguson. So Ferguson's leading a force of militia. He's on the, probably a good 50 miles from Cornwallis on his western flank, goes into North Carolina, makes a bunch of statements he probably shouldn't have made. The famous one, and I've never really seen a contemporary documentation of this, that he's going to march into what's now eastern Tennessee, and lay waste to the country, and if these folks that settled in that area caused any stir, which is exactly what they do. You don't threaten people who live on the frontier like that. And so you have a large number of militiamen forming. You've got people coming down from Virginia. You got militia coming from Georgia. You got militia raised in South Carolina, and they all congregate together and they start chasing Ferguson. And Ferguson doesn't. His intent is to try and join Cornwallis, but he knows he's not going to make it. So he encamps at Kings Mountain, which is right on the North Carolina-South Carolina border, in early October. They completely surround Kings Mountain on October 7th. Ferguson has a few regulars with him, but most of his men are loyalist militia as well. It's a pretty vicious battle. They completely overwhelm Ferguson. A lot of the loyalists are starting to surrender. You still have Whigs firing at him, shooting him down. Ferguson tries to break out, and he's killed by an innumerable number of rifle balls, and is killed at the end of the battle. And just to give you a sense of how vicious it was, several of the Whig militiamen are going to urinate on his dead body. And then in the weeks after, when they're marching the loyalist prisoners away, they actually hang about 9 of them. Had tried 25 of them, and were actually going to hang them all, but they only end up hanging 9. So it's, you often refer to the war in the backcountry between patriots/Whigs and loyalists as a civil war, and it very much was.
Yeah, and these men who are fighting the Over Mountain men were longtime Indian fighters. They were used to brutal fighting and regular fighting all the time. So the fact that they fought without a lot of traditional officers leading them was impressive. I remember Sumter missed the Battle of Kings Mountain because he had to go. There was some dispute over whether he was the top officer in the army at the time.
That's correct. Yeah. Went
to get that resolved, and he missed the battle entirely. So the men really fought the Battle of Kings Mountain without some of their top leaders, and won nonetheless. And that pretty much wiped out the Loyalist movement in South Carolina. From that point on, the British had really no ability to recruit more Loyalist soldiers.
They still, some of them still do turn out now, but they're never able to come out in that number ever again. I mean, because one of the places that a lot of Ferguson's men were raised in the 96 district, and that was kind of the loyalist heavy area. And so once you're kind of taking care of all the loyalists in that part of South Carolina, you still have pockets in other areas, but they're not able to raise in those numbers ever again.
And at this point, General Greene's coming down with a third Continental Army, but Greene takes on a bit of the guerrilla tactics that we've seen in South Carolina, but it's also something that Washington has been pushing up north. The idea that it doesn't matter if you win or lose a battle, it mostly matters that you keep your army in the field and don't let let a third army get captured.
Yeah.
So this ends up being the race to the Dan. They end up leaving South Carolina, they go into North Carolina, and Greene moves all the way up into Virginia to get away from Cornwallis. And then once he, I guess, regroups, he comes back down. I guess the other big battle is a few months after Kings Mountain is Cowpens, which is probably the last really big battle in South Carolina. And that's Daniel Morgan doing his most famous battle strategies of putting the militia out front, having Banastre Tarleton rush in with his men, and then get really decimated by artillery and Continentals who are behind the militia. And that really wipes out Banastre Tarleton as a fighting force. He escapes the battle, but his force is essentially annihilated. And that was one of Cornwallis's most important fighting segments. So he's lost all of his loyalists at Kings Mountain. He's lost Tarleton's cavalry at Cowpens. And at that point, Cornwallis really ceases to be a fighting force in the Carolinas. He retreats to the coast, and then he ends up moving north up to Yorktown, where we all know what happens to him there. But South Carolina is still under British rule. I guess Lord Rawdon is in command at this point.
Yeah, Rawdon is the ranking officer after Cornwallis goes to Wilmington and then up to Virginia.
Greene comes back down to South Carolina and still is unable to really take back the state. I guess he takes back large portions of the countryside, but he's unable to take Charleston and the surrounding region. What was going on with the fighting there?
I have to credit Ian Saberton with this argument. Ian Saberton, he's the one who published the Cornwallis papers from the Southern campaigns, and it's really a terrific resource. Keeps people from having to go look at a bunch of microfilm. Saberton basically says, for lack of a better way of phrasing it, that he hung these guys out to dry, the remaining British troops in South Carolina. A number of posts throughout the state at Camden, Fort Watson, Fort Mott, 96, Georgetown, and so he takes the bulk of his army, up to Virginia, and just leaves these guys behind, and kind of indicates he might come back, but he never does, because he and Clinton decide to establish that base at Yorktown. So Greene, once he realizes that Cornwallis isn't a threat to him, he marches right back into South Carolina and is really super effective at using his Continental forces in concert with the militia troops that are in South Carolina, the men that had fought under Sumter or fought under Marion. The two that really have a great working relationship is Light Horse Harry Lee and Francis Marion. The two of them take Georgetown, they take Fort Mott and Fort Watson, and they basically just pick off these British posts one by one, right? Because once the Patriots surround these places, there's nothing the British can do. There's no additional force that can march to their aid, right? And so they're going to kind of be picked off one by one. So anyway, Greene then, he goes with his force against Camden. He fights Rawdon at the Battle of Hobkirk's Hill through just a major mistake by the Maryland Continentals, which was very unusual because, they're some of the best troops in the Army. The Americans are going to retreat from that battle, probably about even casualties on both sides. But the real kicker to that is, and this is what happens with Greene, all of Greene's losses, because he never really wins a tactical battle in South Carolina, is Rawdon has taken so many casualties given the size of his force that he can't hold Camden any longer. And so about 2 weeks after the Battle of Hobkirk's Hill, he's going to retreat. Partly of that is because Marion and Lee were so effective, because Marion and Lee are reducing the forts that are kind of supporting and surrounding Camden. And that's going to be the story of the rest of 1781, because eventually Greene's going to besiege 96. It's a long siege, starts in May, ends around the middle of June. British are going to send a relief force up from Charleston, which had just arrived from Ireland, and Greene's got to break off the siege. But again, this is an isolated British outpost in the middle of nowhere now. John Harris Kruger, who's the commander there, has got evacuated a couple of weeks after the siege ends. So after 96, the British are pretty much confined mostly to the area around Charleston. The last battle that Greene fights is at Eutaw Springs. Again, a defeat, but British suffer so many casualties again that they essentially give up their posts around Eutaw Springs and are going to, by the fall, have completely just confined themselves into Charleston. The famous quote from Greene is that, we fight, get beat, rise, and fight again. And it kind of goes back to what you said earlier, Mike. Greene, I think he takes it personally that he can't win these battles, but he takes to heart Washington's advice. The key is making sure that the Continental Army survives in some form, and that's what he's very good at. Guilford Courthouse, he does that. At Hobkirk's Hill, he does that. At 96, and at Eutaw Springs, when he sees that it's turned against him, he pulls his troops out. And so, a lot of credit has to be given to him, because he knows if those Continental forces survive, that the Patriot cause is going to survive in South Carolina.
Right, and he is successfully forcing the British into a smaller and smaller area of control. After Eutaw Springs, they really are only controlling a few miles around Charleston, and that's about it.
Yeah.
And of course, they stay there until the evacuation happens. Yeah, I remember Utah Springs was where William Washington was captured, one of the big cavalry.
That's correct. Yep. Yep. In fact, the funny thing about that is he is paroled in Charleston, and I think he knew Susanna Elliott already. But she was in Charleston, and they literally got married while he was on parole in Charleston. His house actually still exists on Meeting Street in downtown Charleston.
I was going to say the capture was probably the best thing that ever happened to him.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
But you have another book on the prisoners of Charleston. I was curious if how we know a lot about the prisoners in New York and the horrific conditions under which they lived. How do you think Charleston compared to the New York POWs?
I mean, there's not as many deaths because you're only talking of the 6,000 men that are captured in May 1780. About 3,000 of them are Continentals, and roughly 300 of those are officers, and those guys are paroled over to Mount Pleasant, and they have pretty good accommodations. The Continental enlisted, however, are first sent in the barracks in Charleston, which is basically on the campus of the College of Charleston today. But the interesting thing about those barracks is they were just within a few hundred yards of the American defense lines from the siege. So a lot of these guys who served in the siege of Charleston, they knew, every nook and cranny of these defenses. And one loyalist estimated that roughly 1,000 Continentals, and I think he probably overestimates this number a little bit, but there were a good number, escaped just by, sneaking out of the barracks at night and, making their way through the lines. So after Camden, you get another influx of prisoners, probably another 500 to 600 prisoners. It's never been determined exactly how many, but it's several hundred are going to come into Charleston. And the British are like, okay, we're having to deal with these escapes. We got to find places for these guys. So that's when they start putting them on prison ships out in the harbor. Now, it's not that the prison ships are so bad, but they put them out there at a really tough time of year. And that's in, September, October. And that's really kind of high malaria season in Charleston in the 18th century. In fact, there was a saying in the colonial period about Charleston that in the spring it was a paradise, in the summer it was a hell, and in the fall it was a graveyard. And the reason for that is because, and they didn't understand, what the disease was, but you have, malaria and yellow fever, which is obviously mosquito-borne diseases that are killing off a lot of people. And unfortunately, a lot of these soldiers who, Maryland, Delaware Continentals are not used to this climate, and they're, susceptible to it. You also have a good number of militiamen who have smallpox that are brought down from Camden. And now, most of the Continentals are going to be inoculated from smallpox, but you do have a lot of deaths among those who are not inoculated, and certainly not among the militia prisoners that were kept on the prison ships. British suffer some food shortages during the winter of 1780-81, where they can't even provide meat to their own men. So, these guys are really suffering in terms of provisions. And you actually have some recruiting going on among the British, among the prisoners. And a lot of prisoners do join the British just because the conditions are so bad on these vessels.
Yeah. What was life like in occupied Charleston for the civilian population? Was it much like New York, or did I'm assuming the Patriots mostly left, so there were mostly loyalists in the city. Were they suffering from deprivation as well? How did they fare?
So large number of loyalists in the city, but you also have a large number, of wives and families of patriots who stay. You do have a large number of paroled militia officers. So the terms of the Articles of Capitulation signed at the surrender of Charleston were that Continentals would be prisoners of war, but the militiamen in town would be prisoners on parole and could go home. Now, a lot of these men were from Charleston, right? And so they stay in the city. And that's going to cause them a pretty big issue because several men, including Christopher Gadsden, who I mentioned earlier, Thomas Hayward, has signed the Declaration, Edward Rutledge has signed the Declaration. They keep up a correspondence with people in the backcountry. And that was, per the Articles of Capitulation, was a no-no. They were not supposed to engage in any activities that would, impede the British war effort. So after Camden, the British find out about this, probably because they found some correspondence in Gates's papers. So at the end of August, they round up a number of these men. They put them on a ship off of Charleston for a couple weeks, and then they send them down to St. Augustine in Florida, and basically exile them out of South Carolina. The following November, they round up another contingent and send those men down there as well. So the British realized that, I mean, to be honest, were the Americans out of line breaking the parole? Absolutely they were, right? But as I mentioned earlier, the British were fighting an unconventional war.
One of the things that had been proposed to help South Carolina with the war effort, I think Lincoln proposed this, as did native son John Lawrence, was to arm a regiment or several regiments of slaves to help fight for the Patriot cause. And this, of course, was almost summarily rejected by the South Carolina leadership. Do you think they felt it just wasn't needed, or were they just willing to, they were happy to lose the war if it meant keeping their slaves?
I mean, closer to the latter, honestly, Mike. They were not about to. They were not about to put arms in the hands of enslaved people. Now, Lawrence's proposal was that they would gain their freedom by fighting for the Americans, but they had long memories here. And just 35 years before the Revolution, you had the Stoner Rebellion, where it was an armed uprising by enslaved people here, and so the South Carolina Assembly was not about to let that happen, and I don't think they would have had a lot of support among the plantation owners either, right? Because they're facing, it's the same argument at the end of the Civil War. You're having the loss of a lot of wealth, or the threat of the loss of a lot of wealth, if you're turning over, you're enslaved to fight in the war effort. Yeah, so they did not want to do anything to risk the system of slavery that existed in South Carolina.
And even having freed slaves that were good with arms could be the head of a slave rebellion at some later time.
Sure, exactly.
That was always their greatest fear, was a massive slave rebellion.
Sure.
Similar to what eventually happened in places like Haiti.
Mm-hmm.
The outcome was a happy one. Well, not for the slaves, but for South Carolina whites at least. The British did eventually evacuate Charleston. I guess that was after the treaty was signed in London, and things went back to, they survived as an independent state and part of the United States. One of the questions I'm going to put you on the spot on a little bit. South Carolina recently came out with a license plate that claims where the Revolutionary War was won. Can you defend that claim?
I absolutely can. I actually just submitted an op-ed piece to our local newspaper defending that. So, it all starts here in Charleston, right? They come here, they take Charleston, and their plan, was to move into the backcountry, arm those loyalists, put the rebels out of their misery. And, it's very similar. I go back to this comparison to Vietnam. It's very similar where the British, because it's not just Francis Marion Thomas Sumter. There's partisan commanders around South Carolina who are, raising men and, suppressing either the loyalists or, resisting the British in some way. And, I will say this, the British certainly overestimated the number of loyalists here. And part of the reason for that is because the Patriot government in South Carolina was really very effective at driving people out of the state, making sure that they took oaths of allegiance, and, they were really super effective at suppressing them. So that's why they don't raise in significant numbers. So anyway, they're facing, this guerrilla war essentially in South Carolina. Cornwallis despite his move into North Carolina, he eventually has to retreat. Battle of Kings Mountain, right? He once that happens, he's got to fall back, so he goes back into South Carolina. Greene comes down. Greene is going to break up his force, sends Morgan. Morgan wins that massive victory at Cowpens. And with the loss at Cowpens, Greene is still inferior in numbers. That's why he's got to retreat into North Carolina. Cornwallis is going to chase him, right? And if that doesn't happen, if he doesn't go into North Carolina and lose at Guilford Courthouse, he doesn't go down to Wilmington, he doesn't go to Yorktown. And that's, kind of what we're basing that claim on, that the conditions that brought Cornwallis to Yorktown and his ultimate defeat would not have happened without the events that happened here in South Carolina in late 1780 and into 1781.
Okay. I mean, South Carolina was certainly a part of the victory. I think the statement might be a little overclaimed.
Well, again, you don't have the Battle of Cowpens and you don't have the Battle of Kings Mountain. Cornwallis doesn't end up where he does.
That's true. But let's face it, Virginia was where it was won in the end.
Well, yeah. I mean, and that's the point I'm making in my op-ed piece is, no one disputes that that Yorktown is the climactic final victory, right?
Yeah.
But the question has to be asked: if Yorktown doesn't happen, what happens, right? I mean, the British aren't ever going to take South Carolina. They're never going to take a good part of the South. There's just too much resistance. One argument is that the Patriot finances were about ready to collapse anyway, but Marion and Sumter and the other guys in South Carolina fight without a government in place, right? That's taken at the fall of Charleston. So obviously those what if questions are hard to get around because there's always another what if. But we're standing by it. It's on our license plate.
All right. Well, I want to open it up to questions. Does anybody have any questions for Carl?
Hey, excuse me, Mr. Troy. I did send a question in the chat, and you were very effective at asking questions that basically covers most of it. This is Roger Sylvia from Rhode Island, by the way, if you're wondering. But just wondering if maybe specifically the last question I asked about Francis Marion being so important strategically in the culmination may be a great question for our guest speaker because of his knowledge of this particular area and this particular person. I don't want to take up too much time if you don't find it worthy, but I did want to just stress the last part of my question.
Okay, yeah. Carl, can you speak to Marion's strategic role as opposed to just his tactics as a guerrilla fighter?
Yeah, so kind of the genius of Marion, and this is what I always impress on the Special Forces guys, because he's the father of U.S. Special Forces, is that he's a regular Continental officer, right? He's actually at the Battle of Sullivan's Island as he's a captain at that point in the 2nd South Carolina, and pretty much preferred conventional tactics. The way that Continental Army fights, and fixed linear formations, but that's the genius of Marion, right? So he goes out and completely changes his tactics. He's now raising, relatively small bodies of men, very dependent on mobility. Most of them are mounted. He's very effective in making sure that loyalists that are raising, they're or gathering together are attacked and suppressed. He understands that the British are dependent on supplies coming out of Charleston to Camden and to these other places around South Carolina. So that's another thing he does, is he's constantly trying to interdict British supply lines. So he has a really good understanding of what the British need to do to succeed in South Carolina, and he's very persistent about how he operates against them. Sometimes again with just a few men, and after a few weeks, a lot of his guys come home and he's got to re-recruit the whole force. So he's clearly a very impressive man in terms of being able to convince men, hey, let's go out. Even though we're pretty much operating in a small body, we can cause a lot of damage against the British. Here's the other fascinating thing about him. He pivots right back, right? And he and Harry Lee are going to besiege Fort Mott, and they're going to besiege Fort Watson. And they actually use the same kind of tactics, these, building of siege parallels that the British use against the Americans during the Siege of Charleston, on a much smaller scale, obviously. But I mean, that's just the genius of this guy. He's able to flex his tactics to what the situation calls for. And, just his influence really is incredible, because if you look at the Cornwallis correspondence between he and Weems and he and other officers in the fall of 1780, in the summer of 1780, the things that they have to say about this region between the PD and the Santee, which is, probably several hundred square miles overall, they think that whole area is in rebellion just because of Marion's efforts. And sir, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Troy, for affording this opportunity.
Sure. Happy to have you.
Well, can I just say one quick thing about our exhibit that's coming?
Please.
I don't know if any of you all will have a chance to come to South Carolina. Actually, I know there's at least one person on tonight who's here in Charleston. We've really got a great exhibit that's opening actually 2 weeks from Saturday, called Ringleaders of Rebellion, that's going to be on display at the museum until September. If you have a chance to visit Charleston, they've got some great archaeological materials that are coming from Camden, Utah Springs, 96. And one thing I just want to point out specifically, try to make this quick. Fort Mott was a house that was owned by a Charleston lady. It was in the interior of South Carolina between Camden and Charleston. And the British essentially commandeered it. They built a stockade around it and fortify it. And so Lee and Marion, when they go to besiege it, they're kind of bogged down in the siege and they're not making headway. And so Rebecca Mott is on the property, and Rebecca Mott supposedly comes to them and says, hey, here's a bow and arrow. Would you could set fire to the roof and drive the British out that way, right? So this appears in Lee's memoirs. And for those of you familiar with Henry Lee, he tended to embellish things a little bit. And so we think that's, part of the legend. Well, one of the things that's coming to the museum from these archaeological projects is a burned arrowhead. Fire is an iron arrowhead that was found on the grounds at Fort Mott. And it basically validates that story. So it's kind of one of the cool pieces that we're going to have on exhibit there.
That's really neat to have an actual piece of history that proves the story.
Mark, I thought I'd ask something. Sort of looking at your forthcoming book, I thought maybe you could speak a little bit. Actually, I don't think you spoke about them at all, about Pickens and Clark and their efforts.
Yeah, that's a great question. So Andrew Pickens is one of the officers after the Siege of Charleston. He's not at the siege, but he's one of the officers after the Siege of Charleston who's going to take a parole with the British. The British basically, after the fall of Charleston, say, hey, listen, anybody who takes a parole, you'll be, allowed to return to your plantation and, you kind of remain out of the fight. But then Clinton issues another proclamation that basically says that anybody who doesn't turn out going to be considered a rebel. So there was a lot of confusion about that. So Pickens, the British actually approached him about leading a loyalist regiment. He has no interest in doing that. So kind of in retaliation, they burn one of his plantations in the upstate. So Pickens is going to break his parole probably sometime in November, December, because he's, he joins Morgan and he plays a major role. In fact, he commands the militia at the Battle of Cowpen. So that's Pickens' story. The other gentleman, Clark. Oh, yeah. So Clark is huge. And, I kind of alluded to the fact, Elijah Clark from Georgia, that the British had not really completely pacified Georgia, despite the fact that they said they had pulled one star from the American flag. Clark continues, just like Marion and Sumter, very effective at raising men. He makes raids into South Carolina. He threatens 96. He's one of the reasons that Cornwallis returns after Kings Mountain returns to South Carolina is that he hears that Clark is threatening 96 again. So I know I've focused a lot on Marion and Sumter, but Elijah Clark played a huge role not only in Georgia but also in South Carolina.
Yeah, we had a lot to cover tonight in a relatively short time, and there were really probably dozens of Patriot leaders all over the region who were contributing to this effort that we could talk about forever. In some ways, it ties back to the talk we had last month with Mark Lender in his book War Without Mercy, that this really did become an all-out battle of neighbor against neighbor and just everybody fighting everybody, and there weren't necessarily any front lines, and it really, you didn't know where the threat was going to come from next. And creating that level of chaos is what prevented the British from, solidifying their control of the state. Anybody else?
You addressed a part of this. I'm coming down to Charleston from Philadelphia this spring, and you mentioned the museum. Is there any other sites that are close to Charleston that I should visit?
At Monk's Corner, there's an extant British fortification called Fort Fairlawn. I would highly recommend that. That's really cool. The old exchange in Charleston is where a lot of the Patriot prisoners were kept. They actually have a dungeon. You can take a dungeon tour to see where Patriots were kept during the war. We have a colonial powder magazine. It's a loose connection to the Revolutionary War, but it was a powder magazine that existed at the time of the war. And then, whatever battlefields that you can go to in South Carolina, 96 is fantastic. They've reconstructed the American parallels, and the Star Fort that was there is extant. So Camden, they've really done some great things with. And so, whatever battlefields you can visit in South Carolina, I would highly recommend.
Well, Carl, I really want to thank you for joining us tonight. Carl Borick, director of the Charleston Museum in Charleston, South Carolina. We had a great talk tonight about South Carolina's role in the war, and I appreciate you taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you so much, Mike. I appreciate the opportunity to do so.
Once again, I'd like to thank Carl Borick for joining our roundtable for a great discussion about South Carolina's role in the American Revolution. Near the end of our talk, Mr. Borick mentioned a new temporary exhibit at the Charleston Museum called Ringleaders of Rebellion, Charleston and Revolt, 1775 to 1783. That exhibit opened on January 31st, 2026, and will be available for viewing through September 20th. I've included a link to the exhibit in my show notes in case you want to take a closer look at what you can see there. I've also included links to Mr. Borick's 3 books about the American Revolution. If you'd like to join us live on future Zoom events with authors, please make sure to sign up for my mailing list or as a member on Patreon. Those are the two locations where I will post Zoom links for people who want to participate in our live monthly events. I've included links to both my mailing list and my Patreon page in the show notes and in the blog entry for this episode. Keep in mind that you can be a free member on Patreon and still get access to this information. Well, that's all for this week. Thank you for joining us on the American Revolution podcast.